We are live, Brian. Happy New Year, Brian. Glad to have you on board. How's your New Year going for you?
For me personally, it's going okay. As far as the state of the world, I'm not so sure. I want to wish you a happy New Year, and also to your audience. Um, I some people say that it's just a date on the calendar. I think sometimes it is a chance to try to start something over anew. But as far as say the situation in Ukraine, this is something that's just going to crash from one year to the next year, unfortunately.
Yeah, I just also want to wish Happy New Year to all of our listeners and viewers today. And thank you for all the moderators who have come on board. You guys know who you are, all the regulars. I really appreciate your help and support. And I hope everyone's had a great New Year's and looking forward to a great New Year this year as well. And so, without further ado, I was going to kind of talk about a few issues that's happening around the world, but I wanted to kind of get your views about what you think. What are your predictions for the new year? And I'm going to separate them in three categories. What are your predictions with regards to Ukraine? What do you think may happen? Secondly, Russia. What do you think Russia might escalate? Do you think things might escalate between the West and Russia? And I also want to bring up China as well. Do you think the West would be bored of Ukraine this year and try and push something with Taiwan, for example? And I also want to talk about maybe how you think the dollar is doing, because I can see that the dollar is starting to do badly this year and the gold is prices have been going up. So I just wanted to kind of see what your thoughts about the economy would be. So I'll start with Ukraine and and Russia and see what your thoughts about this year and what your predictions.
So, in terms of predictions, I mean, this is always something hard to do, and this is all speculation.
Mm,
But I would imagine that Russia is going to continue doing what it has been doing. It has openly said that this is basically a war of attrition. They want to grind down Ukrainian forces. At the same time, back at home in Russia, they are building up their military industrial capacity, which was already enormous. They're building that up to be even larger. Right before New Year, I was talking about these new defensive positions that Russia was building, extensive and very long defensive fortifications. The New York Times covered this, included pictures and diagrams to explain just how extensive they are. And I would imagine this is to confound any possible Ukrainian offensive in the future, but also possibly obstruct any sort of U.S. intervention or a wider NATO intervention. You've got something on the screen there, AJ.
no, yeah, I know. This is just a kind of brief summary of all the talking points we're going to talk about today. So I'm just
Okay,
highlighting it.
great.
And do you think? I was going to ask, try and do you think things will escalate? Because every day you see stories happening with, obviously, you have the latest story with what's happened to the Russian troops. Do you think Russia would one day this year say enough is enough and starts to kind of escalate things with the West?
I really don't think so. I mean, anything is possible. What I think is Russia appears to be settling into a long-term, large-scale, protracted state of warfare in Ukraine. They're preparing for all contingencies. And I was watching their video about the situation in Syria, and Alex and Alexander, they brought up a really good point. They said, if you're wondering how Ukraine is going to turn out, look at how the situation in Syria is turning out. And remember, this is a conflict in Syria that's been going on for over a decade now. I mean, it started in 2011. It is continuing in a certain way up to and including today. And now Russia's got Turkey and Syria talking directly, and it looks like the U.S. is going to get pushed out eventually. It's a step-by-step process. How did Russia get from the U.S. almost overthrowing the Syrian government, using Al-Qaeda and ISIS as their proxies, to this point where it's going to be the U.S. that gets thrown out of how did we get to this point? Russia is incredibly patient. They do everything incrementally, step by step. They're patient in the sense that they will not be provoked. They try to avoid escalating. When they see the U.S., because that's all the U.S. knows how to do, when the U.S. is attempting to escalate, that's what they did all throughout the proxy war in Syria. They tried to escalate. They tried to directly intervene in a much wider sense. And Russia very carefully prevented them from doing that each time. And I suspect that that is a process they're going to try to do in Ukraine. Now, you just mentioned this HIMARS strike on this Russian troop assembly. Russia, first they said 60 something. Now they say it's up to 89. Right as it happened, Ukraine said, hey, it was like 400 or 600 troops dead or injured, something like that, a ridiculously large number. And how could they possibly have known? Russia is still counting the dead. How does Ukraine already know the full number of dead? So it's like everything else Ukraine says is most likely a fabrication. Everything else Ukraine says is a fabrication. I highly doubt this is the first time they're telling the truth. HIMARS, and I've said this from the beginning, it gives them a capability that they had at the very beginning of this special military operation. Ukraine has multiple launch rocket systems, long-range artillery. They even had missiles. The Tochka-U, it's not as good as the Iskander or as precise, but it's still a long-range weapon they can strike targets with. They had all of these capabilities. They were carrying out strikes like this. It's just when you compare the number of strikes that they're carrying out versus what Russia is carrying out, the scale of Russian precision long-range strikes dwarfs Ukraine's capabilities. It always has and it always will. So this happened on December 31st, if I'm not mistaken, and the West is still talking about it over a week now. Why are they still talking about this single strike a week later? It's because it does not happen that often. They do not have successes like this that often. If you follow the Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense, they talk about precision strikes on troop assemblies, equipment assemblies, maintenance facilities, all of these different targets on a nearly daily basis. They carry out strikes like this on a nearly daily basis. Someone said Russia hit that Ukrainian assembly point as retaliation, and I don't think that they did. I think they were just doing what they do almost every single day, which is carry out these long-range precision strikes. They have the Iskander missile complex. It's like the ATACMS that Ukraine keeps asking the U.S. for, only they have more of them, and they go a further range than the ATACMS. And this is what they use to carry out these type of strikes. So I think it's being blown out of proportion. I think the West and Ukraine are obsessed with optics, and their obsession with optics in this case actually reveals how weak and how poorly Ukraine is actually doing.
Completely right, Brian. I also want to bring up the point about what Duran said about Ukraine turning into Syria. I think that's probably the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is Ukraine turning into the next Afghanistan. I mean, what if Ukraine becomes such a failed state and the whole of the West just turns its back on it? And that would be probably the worst thing that could happen. And I also wanted to talk about your predictions about what do you think there could be further escalations regards to the island of Taiwan this year, for example. Do you think the West might be bored with Ukraine and start pushing the Taiwan issue? Because even a week ago, there was a lot of escalations regarding with Taiwan, and I think China had to send a lot of planes around ADs as well, and which was reported. But this was also down to US kind of escalating the situation. But what are your thoughts on what would happen this year?
Yeah, I don't think that the U.S. will get bored with Ukraine and then turn its attention toward Taiwan. I think both are directly connected. This has always been part of U.S. Primacy over the globe and eliminating peer and near-peer competitors. So Russia and China are both peer or near-peer competitors that the U.S. wants to eliminate, and they have been pursuing a strategy to encircle and contain both of them. And as we can see, Russia and China are getting closer together precisely because of this. There's many other factors that they share, they're neighbors essentially. So there's many other reasons that they're doing business with each other. But the urgency of this relationship is driven by U.S. efforts to contain, divide, and destroy both countries. And so the Taiwan issue is directly connected to the Ukraine issue. The U.S. is using both of these areas, these geographic areas, as a leverage point against Russia and China, respectively. So they're going to continue provoking China by meddling in Taiwan, promoting separatism. But again, it's just like in Ukraine. There's only so much they can do. They are a waning power each year. Their problems multiply, and their ability to create problems diminishes. China is being extremely patient. Time is on their side. Taiwan is their territory. It's their people. They speak the same language. It's just across that strait. They just have to sit and wait. It's going to fall. It's going to fall into their hands. They don't really have to do anything. And the more the U.S. attempts to provoke, it seems, we saw the local elections in Taiwan. It seems people there living on that island reject this U.S.-sponsored push for separatism, this U.S.-sponsored attempt to transform Taiwan into another Ukraine. I think people are wise to it, and they reject it. But you can't underestimate the U.S. either.
Sure. I mean, John North made a good point. He says, is it too late to take on China? They are now prepared. And I read an article coming out of the US that the fact is, if they do eventually get into a battle with China, they need to do it sooner rather than later, because each year China gets more and more powerful. But I mean, I think I agree with John. I think it's now too late. What are your thoughts? I mean, I saw an article last week as well. I saw China for the first time has sent a battle group out with its aircraft carrier and Type 55 destroyers, Type 52 destroyers, and a fleet of other ships and submarines. And this is the second country that's done that, apart from the United States. So, I mean, this is and the West wasn't even reporting on it that much, to be honest. And this is a huge news, because suddenly China has come along with this huge battle group and sailing along the Pacific Ocean. What are your thoughts about all of this? Is it too late, or?
I think John North is right. I think it's too late to take on China, but I think the U.S. is going to try anyway. They're still going to push. The U.S. is getting weaker. China is getting stronger, but that doesn't mean that the U.S. is helpless. They still have tremendous capacity to stir up trouble, not only in and around China, but in its periphery here in Southeast Asia. There are still very much ongoing efforts by the U.S. to undermine and overthrow China-friendly governments here and replace them with governments that will destroy the targeted country. I'm in Thailand, so they would try to destroy Thailand. They would try to use Thailand to complicate China's rise economically and the region's rise economically. This is what the U.S. is doing. They've done it very well in Europe. They're doing a great job destroying Europe and denying Russia a partner right there in its periphery and transforming it into an enemy. And that is the same process they're pursuing here in Southeast Asia. We see the U.S., they were doing something very similar in the Middle East. They are failing. They are being pushed out. And we can only hope that the same happens here in Southeast Asia and the same happens eventually in Europe. The U.S. is much more deeply dug in Europe than they are in the Middle East, and then even less so in Southeast Asia. So we just have to hope. The governments here are pursuing a strategy of patience. They do not want a direct confrontation with the United States. They're just trying to let the clock run out. So we just have to see. We have to keep a very close eye on it. I think it's too late. I think China is, if not completely prepared, they're very nearly prepared. And there's a lot of aspects to that discussion, militarily, economically, technologically. They're pursuing a whole range of fields to prepare themselves for a potential conflict, or I should say, to deter a potential conflict with the United States.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brian. I want to go back to the HIMARS issues again, and And obviously, the Ukrainians use these HIMARS as a targeting system. But initially, when they bought the HIMARS, the US said that these HIMARS would only be used as a defensive weapon. But now it seems like Ukraine is using these as an offensive weapon. And I also saw a Washington Post article saying that there is a setting on the HIMARS which sets how far these rockets can go. The United States basically hard-coded a setting that it can't go further than a certain amount of certain range. But this setting seems to be can be easily hacked if you know what you're doing, and also I was thinking maybe these HIMARS and the intelligence used was basically NATO or coming out of the US, because I don't think the Ukrainians have the skill or the know-how to find this kind of intelligence, because the stories coming out saying one of the troops, Russian troops, used a mobile phone and they managed to get his signal, and they used the HIMARS to kind of attack that building. What are your thoughts about all of this?
From the U.S. point of view, when they say using the HIMARS in a defensive manner, they mean Ukraine using it to attack Russian forces anywhere Kiev considers to be Ukrainian territory. So, in a certain sense, the way they meant it, this would still be considered defensive use. The settings that they were talking about, this was in regards to the ATACMS missiles. I don't think this had anything to do with the rockets. I don't know the full details of these settings. It could be like when you have a DJI drone, the DJI network, they will see certain areas on the map, like with the GPS, and they will block you out of certain areas automatically if it's like an airport or something. Maybe they have a similar system on the HIMARS, and they just say we're not going to let you fire over the pre-conflict border into Russia. Maybe that's what they said, but maybe not. Maybe they just made that up to create plausible deniability for themselves. Now, how they managed to do this, I think that Ukraine has been, I'm certain Ukraine has been carrying out attacks like this all along. They're just very few and far between. Most of the time, they'll hit targets where there are not that many troops, where not that much damage is done, or the damage may seem significant, but in the grander scheme, it is not. And they're seizing upon this because of the large casualty number. And that's about it. And again, when you think about it, 300 up to 1,000 on really bad days. Ukrainian soldiers die almost every day. So,
Yeah.
for Ukraine and the West to say, "Well, 89 dead Russian soldiers on one strike," that apparently does not happen all that often. Again, they're seizing upon this politically because it means nothing strategically. That is the whole point, and that is why they're talking about it a week later. I think they've been carrying out attacks like this, but it's just few, far between, and making no difference in terms of the outcome of this conflict.
Sure. I think I was looking at some Russian channels, and one of the talking points in the Russian channels were why did they put so many soldiers in one location? I think that's one of the kind of criticisms that they were giving to the Russian army. And why did they allow some of these soldiers with mobile phones to kind of send signals out for New Year's and stuff? Do you think it's a case of a lucky shot by the Ukrainians, or do you think it's more of a case of complacency from the Russians?
I think it's complacency on the part of the Russians. Again, it was a holiday. You should never put large numbers of troops concentrated in one area. Within a certain range of, they do correlation of forces. They know what Ukraine has available to them, and they know how far they need to put things back to avoid a situation exactly like this. So there was a lapse of judgment somewhere. There was complacency somewhere. There needs to be an investigation. There will be an investigation. But again, Russia carries out strikes like this on Ukraine on a nearly daily basis. No one talks about investigating them. How did it happen? It just goes to show you how lopsided the fighting is. And the fact that this has become such a huge issue only highlights more so how lopsided the fighting is in Russia's favor.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, so let's go to the second talking point. I wanted to talk about what you think about Poland amassing troops on its border and getting troops conscripted. What do you think Poland has got planned? Do you think they might go into Ukraine, try and go up to Lviv and trying to get back Lviv at some point this year?
This is very hard to tell. I don't think Poland would do anything without approval by the United States. I think the United States has nominated Poland as the next proxy of choice after Ukraine is spent. They would like to perpetuate this for as long as possible. They have no exit strategy. It's always to escalate, and escalate until either they succeed or until everything falls apart, like in Afghanistan or now in Syria. So this is what they're trying to do in Ukraine. So I have no doubt that the U.S. is encouraging Poland to step in where Ukraine fails and falls down. They want Polish troops to move in and continue fighting. That is one possibility. That, again, speculation. We don't know for sure. Creating a buffer zone in Western Ukraine, I've been warning about this since this all began. This is something the United States did in Syria. They created that buffer zone in northern Syria. Well, they had Turkey do that. And then the U.S. themselves, they created one in eastern Syria, east of the Euphrates River. Maybe they have a certain idea to do that in Ukraine. They were able to do it successfully without escalating to direct military conflict with Russia. Maybe they think they can repeat that success in Ukraine. As we can see in Syria, it has not actually led to success, and I don't think that it'll lead to success in Ukraine either. I think it'll just draw everything out even further.
Completely agree. And I think Syria has been an absolute nightmare for the West. And they thought that Syria was the final piece of the jigsaw in regards to the Middle East, because once they've already taken control of Iraq at the time, plus Afghanistan. They had good relations with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and obviously there was Yemen as well, which they got Saudi Arabia to attack Yemen. And I believe that once they got hold of, did the regime change on Syria, they would have pretty much controlled most of the Middle East. But think how things have turned sour in the Middle East for the United States. And now you have Saudi Arabia and Qatar going against the West, like Dubai as well. They've completely lost trust against the West. Iraq wants all of the U.S. troops and influence to be gone out of the country. There's still a small number of U.S. troops in there, and they also control some of the oil contracts as well. And there's and it's just all going pear-shaped for the U.S. administration, and they're completely losing the Middle East. And what are your thoughts about all of this? I mean, it's almost like, U.S. is like, they play with a bunch of toys. These guys who run the country, they use the world like a chessboard, like a toy piece. And once they done with one part of the world, they move on to the next without finishing the job. And this is what they've done with Afghanistan, and it seems like this is what they're doing in the Middle East. What are your thoughts on how the Middle East is going?
Well, I think it's a good example of the limitations of U.S. power, their primacy over the globe. This was, again, people have to look at this in 4 dimensions, not just the here and now, but over a period of time, both past, present, and then projected into the future. You just think of why the U.S. is doing all of this in the first place. At the end of World War II, the U.S. wanted to assert itself, it and the West, as the ruling circle of power over the planet. The U.S. attempted to assist European imperial powers in gaining back their colonies. That was the whole point of the Vietnam War, was to regain their colonies for France in this case, and also to continue reasserting themselves back over China, because before World War II, the U.S. and other Western countries were in China in the process of attempting to colonize China. So that's what this has all been about over the last couple of decades. they have been trying to reassert themselves as the sole ruling power over the globe, the unipolar world order, so to speak. They're in the Middle East. Again, I think we remember General Wesley Clark's 7 regimes in 7 years speech, where he talked about after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. wanted to wipe out all of these Soviet client regimes, client states, whatever you want to call them. And so that's what that was all about, the war on terror. They were trying to knock over one country after the other, install an obedient, compliant regime in its place. And they ran out of time. They've run out of time. China has risen. Russia has reemerged as a global power, and the U.S. has no more room to move and maneuver. They're being pushed out of everywhere. Everywhere where they did gain, I would say, meager gains relative to their ambitions to control the entire planet, they have been pushed out, and they are being pushed out. So that's where we are right now. We're at the point in time where the window is closing and they're out of options. And we're just waiting to see whether they accept the inevitable, because it is inevitable, or if they try to do something extreme to try to reverse this. Use nuclear weapons, engage in direct war with Russia or China, something like that.
Yeah, great points. Great points, Brian. And recently, they've announced a 1.7 trillion bill, and most of it will be going onto the defense budget. 45 billion more is going to go into Ukraine. And my question to you: how long is this going to last? For example, they've already, in total, they've already given 150 billion to Ukraine in just under a year, because if the conflict started in February, we still haven't reached the full year yet. And if you think about how much they spent in Afghanistan, they spent at least, I think it was average around $1 trillion to $2 trillion, and which averaged around 100 billion per year. So already the costs are going above Afghanistan, way above. And how long do you think it's going to last before Ukraine starts asking for more money? And what's your thought? I know you're American. What's your thoughts about all of this money going into Ukraine? And recently, US had some major issues with the weather. Obviously, they had an extreme cold snap. And I know you're from the New York area. And I saw some images of tents absolutely frozen in New York. And obviously, there was a lot of homeless people inside. And I can imagine a lot of homeless people died during this weather, and so they are not putting any money towards, housing these homeless guys. They're not putting any money into, Americans in general, and they just giving away money to Ukraine like it's like no tomorrow. What's your thoughts about all of this stuff?
Well, this money is not necessarily going to Ukraine. It's going to the proxy war in Ukraine. Yeah. But when they're buying, say, weapons or backfilling orders of weapons, that's going to the U.S. military-industrial complex. It's not actually going to Ukraine. But you're bringing up a really good point. The U.S. is rotting out from underneath itself while they pour money into these foreign adventures. Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East. And this is what happens to all empires. They are so invested abroad trying to keep things going and expanding that everything back at home rots out from underneath them. And then that's how you end up collapsing. And that is what's going on in the US. The US has so much potential to turn inward, invest in itself, and regain all of that. A lot of people still perceive the U.S. as this great country or the greatest country. They still have the ability to reinvest in themselves and reverse this. But of course, they're not going to. These circles of power, the circles of interest in power right now in the U.S., they're not interested. They don't care about the American people. The American people are just another group of people that they divide, distract, dominate over, use, abuse, and exploit. It's just another group of people. So what they do to every other country where they go in like parasites, consume everything and leave it crumbling, that is also what they're doing to the United States. Unfortunately, as long as this conflict in Ukraine is profitable, that's how long it's going to perpetuate itself, unfortunately. Just like in Syria, just like in Afghanistan, 20 years, over $1 trillion in Afghanistan. What did they accomplish? And ultimately they left. What did they accomplish? But that money didn't go into a black hole. It went into defense contractors' accounts. So it went somewhere. It's, the transfer of wealth from the American people into this concentration of power and wealth and influence. And they're doing all of the wrong things with it. And what they're doing is unsustainable.
Okay, so now we're going to now talk a bit more about the China-Russia partnership. And there's a lot of stuff happening around the world which the West doesn't really talk about. For example, the yuan is now the highest form of currency traded in Russia. There's loads of Chinese businesses now moving into Russia. There's infrastructure projects, massive infrastructure projects. There's one massive road. It's a massive highway going all the way from Moscow along the southern Russia, going all the way to China. And this has been on hold for like 10 years, but suddenly it's been approved. Putin himself approved it. There's pipelines going in from Russia, gas pipelines going in from Russia to China. There's roads and bridges being built at a really fast rate because Russia knows that, time is against them. The longer they wait, the more they will be affected economically. So the faster they build these infrastructure projects with China, build links to China, the faster the economy would grow. And all of this stuff is really fast. I read yesterday that there is a bridge that recently got announced between from Russia to China, and this is one of the kind of busiest bridges worked on at the moment. And militarily, you see Russia and China doing joint drills, sharing military information, sharing knowledge, and the West is not even talking about all of this. I mean, what's your thoughts about this growing partnership?
It's interesting. The harder the U.S. attempts to cling to its unipolar order, the more incentive they give the rest of the world to invest in multipolarism. So for Russia and China, they had both invested tremendously into working with the West, into having overlapping interests of cooperation in industry, of, well, we'll build the computers, you send us the chips, things like this. But the United States understood that over time, even though they started out this relationship at the top, post World War II, and then after the Cold War, all the way at the top, they understood that eventually China would eclipse them. Eventually, you would have this better balance of power, even with the system that they had overseen. So what they're trying to do is reverse it, and they're trying to impede growth in China, in Russia. We saw the sanctions against Russia, the European sanctions against Russia in terms of energy. And so what did they actually accomplish, though? Did they actually hurt Russia, or did they isolate themselves? This is what the West is doing. They are isolating themselves, and they are giving Russia and China and many others an incentive to invest heavily in multipolarism. So maybe Russia could not previously they couldn't justify investing so heavily in all of this infrastructure with China because they had a good thing going with the West. But the West themselves cut that off, made that impossible, and now they've given Russia the justification to invest heavily in building all of this infrastructure with China. Now, AJ, you said you wanted to talk about the chips, so maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit.
Sure.
But
you can talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, but so what is China going to do in response to all of these efforts by the U.S. to ban China from getting their chips, ban any product containing Chinese chips? What is China doing? Before, they really couldn't justify investing so heavily in research and development domestically because they had all of these other well-established alternatives that already existed, were already cheap. But because the U.S. is putting up these political barriers to access it, they're now giving China the justification to invest heavily in developing their own chip industry. And again, China has a larger population than the G7 combined. They graduate thousands more in STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, than the United States every single year. They are going to figure it out. Not only are they going to figure it out, but eventually they are going to have the best chips on Earth, and the US will not even be able to compete. So the US went from, okay, the China's going to surpass us, but we're also going to rise with them because they're using, our companies are doing business with them. They're doing business with us. We were all going to rise together. This is what Southeast Asia is doing right now with China. But the US cannot accept that. They cannot accept being number two, no matter how irrational refusing to accept that might seem. So they're doing it this way. And so they're assuring that China's still going to rise. They're just going to be cut out of any sort of peace and prosperity and stability along the way. So it's completely irrational. And we could talk about the mindset of these ruling elite in the West, the combination of incompetence, racism, lack of vision. We could talk about how all of these factors are combining together, and how this is something we've seen in past empires. The imperial thinking, we're superior, and they cannot imagine them ever being wrong. And when you live like that, eventually it's all going to catch up to you. I think that's what we see.
Yeah, I also want to bring up the point that the Filipino president visited China yesterday, and Philippines seems to be one of the countries which was very pro-West over the years, and slowly they have been drifting towards friendly relations with China. And if you can remember that video that we did where these neocons or these I wouldn't call them anything, these stooges were basically using Philippines as a launchpad to attack China in this front of war.
I remember that.
And but they didn't count the fact that now the Philippines is actually looking for friendlier relations with China, and I think that probably is going to go out the door. That idea is not going to happen anymore. And obviously you have high-speed rail links, which was announced by Vietnam only a few months ago, which will link Chinese high-speed rails going to Vietnam. There's also a high-speed rail going into Laos. That's going to be extended into Thailand, and then obviously onto Cambodia, and the whole of the Southeast Asia is going to be interconnected sooner rather than later. And I think the only other issue is with Malaysia, but every other country seems to be on board linking their infrastructure to China. Obviously, Russia is now doing the same thing. And you're 100% right regarding those chips, because you have a huge population in China, but you also have a huge population in Southeast Asia. Indonesia itself has got a huge population. And China also released some news that they've delivered their first C919 airplane, and they've got hundreds and thousands of orders at the moment. And I can imagine a lot of orders coming in from Russia. So when you have a huge aviation kind of country like China, they've got hundreds and thousands of airports, I believe. And now that they've opened up, there's going to be a lot of people flying flying around China, but also Russia as well. And Russia's been sanctioned when it comes to Western airplanes, and now Russia is now buying a lot of these Chinese airplanes as well. And you can see a lot of these links between Russia and China. And if the West decides to cut China off when it comes to chips and other stuff, they're just cutting themselves off. They're just cutting themselves off the Chinese market. And now China's got this massive Russian market as well, which they've got, they've basically got a huge country with full access. They don't have to worry about any competition or anything like that coming in from the West. And this is just going to make the Chinese companies stronger. It's just going to make their economies more stronger, both Russia and in China. And what's your thoughts about all of this stuff?
Okay. Well, first of all, we remember President Xi Jinping saying China's economy is not a pond; it is an ocean. And so things that would normally disturb a pond are unnoticed in an ocean. China has so many people, its own domestic market's so huge. that when the United States tries to isolate, say, so we're talking about the C919 airliner, a Chinese-developed passenger airliner. They're saying, well, we're going to put sanctions. We don't, because we have Airbus and Boeing, it's a duopoly, and we want to maintain it as a duopoly. We don't want competition from Russia and China or anyone else. So what we'll do is we'll use sanctions under the pretext of human rights or national security concerns, and we'll try to strangle these companies before they're able to compete with us internationally. Okay, so you tell China, well, you cannot sell your planes elsewhere around the world because we're going to put sanctions on you. They can just develop their own. First of all, they can counter those sanctions by saying, okay, well, Boeing and Airbus cannot enter into our markets, and we'll use domestically developed aircraft to serve our domestic markets. China's population, it's the geography of China is so large, like you said, all of these airports, all of this air travel, that is going to allow them to build a world-class aerospace industry, not just a company, industry. And then they will eventually start finding ways of doing business with other countries. So Russia is an obvious first customer because they're on the sanction wagon with China. But then there's also other countries, Iran, for example. And then there's going to be other countries that are going to do business with China. They're going to ignore like India is going to do business with Russia, ignore the US and its threats of sanctions. And more countries are going to do this. And eventually China is still going to win. And again, just like with the chips, Boeing and Airbus, maybe they wouldn't have been a duopoly anymore, but they still would have been making money. They still would have had a certain percentage of the market in China. Now they have zero. So they're hurting themselves instead of helping themselves with this obsession with dominating everything. When China is a bigger country in every regard, and you still insist on asserting yourself over them, it makes no sense. And when you're doing something that makes no sense from square one, everything that follows is going to be even further and further off target. So you were talking about the Philippines also. The Philippines has a complex history. It used to literally be a colony of the United States. They have deeply infiltrated academia, the media, all kinds of aspects, socio-political aspects of the Philippines. But also under Duterte, there began this pivot, or I should say a pivot away from subordination to the United States and a more balanced approach between the US and China. And I think that will continue now. So we saw some tensions between the Philippines and China over these islands or proto-islands in the South China Sea. But again, people have to remember, then the Philippines and Vietnam have overlapping claims, and they fight over that also, but not to the extent where it becomes a conflict. So we have to separate that out from all of the cooperation China and the Philippines are engaged in, and the fact that the U.S. really has nothing to offer the Philippines. What does the U.S. have to offer the Philippines that China cannot do better? All the U.S. is doing very transparently is attempting to use Southeast Asia the same way they're using Ukraine in Eastern Europe and the same way they're using Taiwan in East Asia. That's all they're doing. And so when you sign up for complete cooperation with the U.S. at the expense of also maintaining ties with China or anyone else, that's what you're signing up for, becoming a battering ram for somebody else and taking on the cost of a proxy war yourself so that the people using you don't have to pay that cost themselves. That's the situation. And if you want to talk about what will happen in 2023, let's look out for U.S. political meddling in Southeast Asia. There's protests always going on, however small they may be. In Thailand, they have a U.S.-backed opposition that wants to get into power here. They got a U.S.-backed prime minister now in Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim. They're going to try to put pressure on the Philippines. They're going to continue doing this region-wide. We have to keep an eye out for that. And if you're wondering, how or why, just look at what they did in Ukraine in 2014. It's the same process, the same organization, sometimes literally the exact same people behind all of this. And that's why they're doing it. They want to remove governments looking out for their own best interests and replace them with governments that will serve U.S. interests at the cost of the targeted country.
Yes, and you also mentioned Iran as well, and Iran is a very dark horse in terms of world economy. I mean, here you have a country sitting on huge amounts of gas and oil still yet to be kind of extracted from the ground, and they have a huge population as well. Only thing missing is the infrastructure. So I was speaking to somebody from Iran actually. He works. He's a government official, and I'm trying to get him on the show. And he was telling me that in Iran, I mean, no, the West cannot report what happens in Iran. They love to report the protests and stuff, but what the West does not report in Iran is all of the infrastructure projects happening in Iran right now. There's a train going directly from Iran into China, and they're building 2 more trains that will be going directly into China. It's going to go through the Caspian Sea and Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and
Tajikistan.
Tajikistan.
These are very hard to
yeah,
pronounce.
and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan so there's 3 train lines being built from China into Iran, and they're also building a huge train line linking the north and south of the country, and one from east to the west of the country, and that's been going along for the past 5 years or so since China signed this 400 billion deal with Iran. And basically what he told me is what Iran is doing is giving China oil, and in return they're getting help when it comes to infrastructure. So it's basically, this is one way to avoid the sanctions. They're not giving them direct money. They're basically, it's oil for infrastructure, and so there's a lot of infrastructure projects going on in Iran at the moment. And once these infrastructure projects finish, you can imagine how fast Iran would grow, because you're talking about a country with huge potential, and imagine how fast that economy would grow. And any country that has got its footprints in Iran, like China, for example, they're going to reap the benefits. And it's a really dark horse, Iran is, and I think the West has been trying to destabilize Iran for years. They obviously want to put in a friendly leader, like they had in the 70s with the Shah and stuff like that. But they know Iran is the big fish in the Middle East. That's the one big fish that the West want. I mean, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, Iran has been under sanctions for decades. They've also been faced with covert and sometimes overt hostility from the West, and they're still there, and they still do tremendous amounts of development on their own. But now you're talking about China and now also Russia. I mean, one of the things that this conflict in Ukraine has done, and the way the West has been trying to get the upper hand over Russia by completely cutting it off, by completely upending any sort of incentive for Russia to care about its future relationship with the West. All that has done is push Russia and Iran closer together, and because China knows that they're next, push Russia, Iran, and China all closer to each other. And then there's many other nations who have had problems with the West, who realize what's going on, and they're kind of teetering 50-50 in between giving up on dealing with the West and going all in with this growing group of nations that the West is, trying to completely isolate, but then isolating themselves. So Iran is kind of, it's an indicator what is going on in Iran and how Iran is able to overcome these challenges that the West imposes on them is kind of an indicator of the strength or lack thereof of Western hegemony and their ability, their staying power in this contest between unipolarism and multipolarism. The role that Iran has played in stabilizing Syria, that is a major accomplishment. Being able to rout these Western-backed extremists in Syria, but then also in Yemen, this was a huge accomplishment for a country that is under all kinds of sanctions. The military prowess that they've developed and also the military technology that they've developed is also quite extraordinary when you think about the conditions they've done it under.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, and now their drone technology is being used in Ukraine as well. The West is absolutely shocked by how good the Iranian military is, and I think this is one of the reasons they haven't gone into Iran and attack Iran the same way they did to Iraq, because they know that Iran has got a huge military, huge amounts of rockets, and they've also got links throughout, like Hezbollah in Jordan and obviously Yemen and other parts of Middle East as well. And it's a huge problem for the United States. And it seems like Iran was the number one target for years. I mean, I remember 20 years ago, all I could see is, Israel's going to attack Iran. We're going to attack Iran. All options are on the table, and you would think that they were going to attack Iran the same way they did Iraq and Afghanistan, but it never happened. Now obviously, China's become the number one target, and now they're distracted with Ukraine as well. And but yeah, I think Iran has built itself up in a huge way positively. They've even developed their own COVID vaccines, if I remember, as well. So they're very, Iran scientists are very good internationally. A lot of them have studied abroad. They are now helping their country develop. And I can see over the next, with the high oil prices right now, I can see Iran putting more money into its own country and slowly developing. And once these infrastructure projects are in place, Iran's going to be shooting above and beyond. And same way Russia is at the moment, and same way China. I mean, people forget China has been under a military embargo. The West was not allowed to sell China any weapons since the 1980s, and they were banned from the International Space Station. So China always had sanctions, just people don't really talk about it.
Yeah.
And now you see where they are today.
Exactly. Again, you're giving them an incentive to invest in their own country to make up for the fact that they're being cut off in all of these different ways. And if they are successful in that process, they become more self-reliant, self-sufficient, and that gives them a greater advantage in international relations and trade, and also militarily. Look at what's going on in Ukraine. Ukraine is completely dependent on the West. They have to go 1,000 kilometers to the Polish border to drop their equipment off to get fixed, and then bring it another 1,000 kilometers back to the front line to get back into the fight. If you are self-sufficient militarily, you don't have to do that. You can do everything in your own country. And this is something that China has done. This is something that Iran has definitely done. This is something that Russia has also been working on, I would say, quietly for quite a long time, but now much more overtly. And I think the situation with Iran is kind of a microcosm to what's going on globally. The US had this window of opportunity to attack Iran, and that window closed. Now, if they want to attack Iran, Iran has air defense systems that can shoot Western warplanes out of the sky. These conflicts, these proxy conflicts, the West has been waging with Iran in Syria and in Yemen, and also to an extent in Lebanon through Israel and Hezbollah. When you see how poorly Israel did when it went up against Hezbollah, say in 2006, or you see what happened when Western-backed proxies in Syria were wiped out by also contributions by Iran, and the situation in Yemen, and how Yemenis backed by Iran are, exposing systems like the U.S. Patriot air defense system as mostly useless. Then U.S. war planners are looking at that and thinking, well, if we go into Iran itself and we try to wage war on Iran directly, we're going to have all of these problems, and it's not going to be like 2003 Iraq. It's going to be much more difficult, much greater casualties, and it's going to be much harder to try to convince the public that it will be worth the cost going in to win, if we can win. So if Iran is a problem, then Russia and China are an even bigger problem for the US.
That's right. I remember reading a story that Iran attacked one US base with their rockets, and the rockets were very, very accurate. And I think the whole of the West was shocked, pretty much, the audacity that Iran has. And obviously, there was no US casualties at the time, but the fact that they basically attacked a US base with their rockets just as a retaliation of something that the US did. I can't remember exactly, but it just shows their growing capability in Iran. Um, do you think that they will push ahead with the joint comprehensive deal, or is that completely gone out the window, do you
Oh
think?
no, that from the very beginning, before it was even publicly revealed, was always a ploy to draw Iran in, make the U.S. look like a reasonable stakeholder in the process, accuse Iran baselessly of violating it, and then using that as a pretext to pile on more sanctions and inch ever closer toward conflict. This was something explained in great detail in the Brookings Institution's Which Path to Persia paper. I believe that was dated 2009. And they were talking about making a deal with Iran and then claiming Iran broke it and using that as a pretext to go to war with Iran. And you read that paper in 2009. Then you saw the Obama administration rolling out the Iran deal, and then we watched Trump backtrack out of it exactly like the Brookings Institution paper said the U.S. would have to do. And now we see Biden at the very last step, making sure we don't go back into this deal, but also using its failure as a pretext to put further pressure on Iran. This is where U.S. policy comes from. It comes from corporate-funded think tanks. It does not come from Washington. The think tanks have lawyers that turn them into bills. They have lobbyists that bring them to Washington. They also have people from the Western media involved in the think tanks who promote these concepts and these policies to the American people. That is how the government really works versus the diagram in your social studies book back in high school.
The funny thing is that the Europeans need gas right now, so they are desperate for gas. And Iran, Iran's got huge reserves of gas. It would have made sense to make a deal with Iran and try and get hold of all of these Iranian gas reserves. But again, it just shows the Americans have put the Europeans hung out to dry. They don't really care about Europeans' concerns. They rather watch Europe burn than sign a deal with Iran, it seems like. And it just, again, it would have helped the world economy, would have helped the gas situation. It would have definitely helped the Europeans. But no, it just makes sense to kind of sign a deal with Iran. There is, that there's a big, massive Israeli lobby in the United States, and obviously they don't want it. But the fact is, it would have been easier just to kind of have some peace in the Middle East. At the end of the day, Iran is not a threat. Iran is not a country that's going to attack United States or any European countries. They haven't done that. They're not looking to do that. The only crime Iran had was a change of government. They kicked out the Shah and decided to.
I mean, that is the case for everyone. I mean, Russia and China aren't going to attack the United States. It's always about exercising control over these countries and punishing them for not allowing the U.S. to do that. And so you're talking about Europe not being able to sign an agreement with Iran and how that complicates their energy crisis. But the fact that they have an energy crisis in the first place, which they shouldn't, but the fact that they have it in the first place because of the United States, well, we're talking about people who are intent on creating a problem. They're using the EU just as much as they're using Ukraine in this proxy war. They couldn't care less about the outcome of Ukraine or the EU. They don't want the EU to be competitors with the United States. They don't want them to have an independent foreign policy. It's always better to break them down and set them back than to risk allowing them slipping out from under the shadow of American hegemony.
Exactly. And I just can't believe the Europeans are just allowing all of this to happen right under their noses. I mean, obviously, we've seen with the sanctions war, we've seen obviously what's happening with Ukraine. And no European leader, apart from Orban, is coming up and saying, "Look, you know what? Enough is enough. We need to have our own foreign policy. Screw the United States administration. We'll do what we want. Let's do a deal with Iran ourselves." Why? It's almost like they have to kind of ask their big boss for every single decision. I was, oh, can we push through a deal with Iran? And the Americans will be like, nope. Like, oh, okay, fine, no problem then. It's almost like they're taking you know, every single order from the United States, and the United States say no, they're like, oh, all right, that's fine. Let our people suffer. It's not a problem. United States has said no, so nobody's stepping up and say, you know what, enough is enough. We need gas. Let's push through a peace deal. With Ukraine. Yesterday, I read that France is sending more weapons to Ukraine, like old tanks and all sorts. And all of this stuff is just it's just escalating the conflict. If you're going to be sending more weapons and tanks to Ukraine, you're just escalating it. You're not de-escalating it. And it's just a shame, really.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about the French tanks, or I should say light tanks that they're going to be sending to Ukraine. But I just want to make the point: Europe cannot go against the United States any more than, say, the leadership in Kiev right now, because the U.S. put that leadership in there on purpose, knowing that they will never question or talk back to the U.S. They ensure that competent leadership never actually gets into power. That was the whole point of the European Union project, was to make sure that that would never happen, that you create institutions, you create a whole pipeline from education all the way to the top of the EU bureaucracy, and you make sure the right type of people, bureaucrats and system administrators that serve US interests and corporate interests, ultimately, they are the ones that get into power, and people who actually have an idea for independent foreign policy, they get filtered out one way or the other. The same goes for Ukraine. I mean, they had a coup in Ukraine and violently overthrew the last actually elected leader, however flawed the elections might be. That government was clearly looking out for the best interests of Ukraine, whereas the leadership now in Ukraine for the last 9 years, they've been completely destroying Ukraine, completely, and they will completely, fully destroy Ukraine before this is all over. Now, France is talking about sending AMX-10 RC light tanks. When you look at them, you're like, is that actually a tank? Because it's got wheels, and it's not a main battle tank as we think when we hear the word tank, like an M1 Abrams or a T-72 or T-90, something like that. It's a light tank. It's supposed to mainly do reconnaissance. It can also do fire support. That means you have infantry that need a bigger gun to come in and fire. This thing can roll in and fire, but it's not a tank. So it has much lighter armor. Its gun is lighter. It's not a heavy gun like on a tank. The reason tanks have tank tracks is because they are so heavy because of the weight of the armor and also the weight of the heavy gun. So you're trading that off for it to be lighter and more mobile, but it's not as powerful. Now, these are being phased out. So it's old junk that France wants to get rid of. They have 247 of them. I checked. It was a Ministry of Defense presentation from 2021. They had 247 of them. I don't think that they're going to be able to send too many of them because the replacements for them are not going to be in the French military until 2030. So here's another example of the West offloading little small numbers of their junk to Ukraine. They're going to have the exact same problem all of the other equipment they transferred to Ukraine has. It has proprietary ammunition, which means France is going to have to send a constant supply of ammunition for these things to Ukraine. So that is a long supply chain from France all the way to Ukraine. Anytime it breaks down, again, it's going to have to go 1,000 kilometers from the front line to a repair facility in Poland that then they're now going to have to bring in French technicians to work on these things and then bring it another 1,000 kilometers back to the battlefront. Does that sound like France is really helping Ukraine? I mean, it is better than nothing, and that's what Ukraine is starting to face, the not having anything. But it is not going to be able. They're not going to be available in the numbers necessary to outfight Russia, and they're not going to function as proficiently on the battlefield as they would need to outfight Russia. This is going to be a constant problem for Ukraine until this conflict is over.
You're 100% right about the current administration in Ukraine completely destroying the country, killing all of its people. And from an outsider, you see Zelensky going around the world, going on the front page news on Vogue magazine and Time magazine, and going around the world and getting an applause from the Congress, and stealing speeches from past leaders. And it seems like this guy is just in it for himself. He just wants the publicity. He just wants to be in the limelight. He doesn't really care about all of these average Ukrainians who are dying and kind of having really difficult lives in Ukraine. And here he is on front page of the Time magazine. I mean, in any other time, do you ever? I don't remember any other time a wartime leader being on Vogue magazine and Time magazine. You're not going to ever see Churchill or some of the great leaders of the United States like Lincoln or Roosevelt. You won't see them in any Vogue magazine and stuff. I mean, this is an absolute joke. I mean, from an outsider, and the West just cannot see it. I mean, they're just lapping it up. The people are lapping it up. The West is just lapping it up. Is it me, or is the society just going downhill?
Well, no. I mean, I think what you mean is they're in Vogue, which means they had to take a whole day off to do a photo shoot, essentially. You're in the middle of a war. You're supposed to be a wartime leader. Of course, we know Zelensky is nothing of the sort. He is a figurehead, which is why he is able to do that when a real wartime leader has absolutely no time to do that. It would be impossible and, as you say, unthinkable. It's bad optics. But the West and the people with the little Ukraine flag in their profile, they are detached from reality. They live in a fantasy world. So they don't understand that yes, if he was actually running things, that would be impossible for him to do. But he is the figurehead, and that is all he does. He couldn't change things if he wanted to. So he has the carrot is feed his ego. He's on the cover of all these magazines. He gets to do all these speeches. The limelight is always on him. That is the incentive for him to continue doing it. The incentive for him not to do it is if he gets out of line even a little bit, they'll get rid of him. And by get rid of, I mean probably kill him and say the Russians did it. And then they'll bring in someone who will do their job properly. They'll listen and play their role the way that they're supposed to. So for Zelensky, he's in a difficult position. He's not really in charge of anything. I think if we really want to look at who is ultimately responsible, we have to look at Washington, the Pentagon. We have to look at London and Brussels. They're the ones driving this conflict. Everyone else is collateral damage also.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brian. I'm going to move on to the next topic. And 10 billion from that US bill is going to be going into Taiwan. And do you think this is going to be an issue? Do you think this is obviously it's not going to be an issue to China militarily, because 10 billion is not really going to take you far. But is this an issue in terms of escalation? And I believe Taiwan also announced mandatory military to be extended from 4 months to a year as well for all citizens. And so obviously there are steps behind the scenes happening into a potential conflict on both sides. What are your thoughts on this?
For Taiwan, the prospect of it waging any kind of successful armed conflict with the rest of China is absurd. It would be like a single county in the United States trying to take on the rest of the U.S. military. It makes no sense. They will not succeed. This, again, this money going to Taiwan, well, actually it's going to weapon systems made by US corporations. So they're actually the ones benefiting from this, not Taiwan. The people living on that island, they're actually becoming more in danger, because the more weapon systems they fill up the island with, and the further the U.S. tries to push them over the red line, the more danger they're actually in. They don't have any capability of defending themselves. Look at what's going on with Ukraine and understand how much smaller the island of Taiwan is geographically, in terms of population, in terms of actual military hardware that they have to fight back. The fact that China has the largest variety and number of missiles on Earth. They could just use missiles to wipe out every military target on the island before they even step foot on the island. So this is a reality that they face. So the U.S. has no plan, no dream in their head of Taiwan ever coming out on top. The whole point is to throw them into the fire, to create a problem for China, to escalate, to trigger a conflict. They know China wants to reunite fully through peaceful measures. They want to prevent China from being able to do that. And that is it. And they don't care who pays the price on the island of Taiwan. It's thousands and thousands of miles from U.S. shores. Why would they care?
Exactly. And it's never going to be an island where the US can protect, because how are you going to deliver weapons if Taiwan runs out? How are you going to deliver oil and gas, all of this stuff you need in a war? And I don't think Taiwan would last very long. There would be no supplies coming in from the West. And if they do, any ships coming anywhere near the South China Sea or the East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, will probably be blown out of the water. So it'd be almost impossible. The problem with Ukraine is you have weapons coming in from obviously Poland and other friendly countries to the west, but you can't do that with Taiwan. It'd be almost impossible. And it's a shame what they're doing in Taiwan. And I was reading some kind of articles coming out of China as well, and China said that they make it very clear that they would start a war on three red lines. Number one, if Taiwan ever declares independence, which will never happen because Taiwan is not that stupid. They're not going to one day declare independence. But the second thing, and probably the most important thing, is China mentioned that if there is some significant changes to the One China policy, or if there is a Western country that starts building a military base in Taiwan, or any such provocations, would start a war as well. So it's all down to the United States, really. It's not going to be up to Taiwan. It's all down to the United States, and they basically hold all the cards. One day, if they decide to get rid of the One China policy, for example, and that could trigger something. But yeah, I don't think it will happen soon because they are too preoccupied with Ukraine. But it might happen if maybe Trump comes back into power. I don't know, because a lot of Republicans were pushing for this One China policy to be scrapped, and I think more Republicans are for war with China rather than Democrats. I think Democrats are more doing what they're doing now with Ukraine, but the Republicans are really, a lot of them are anti-Chinese. What are your thoughts on that?
But I think that's a good point to bring up. Obviously, Democrat, Republican in the United States, it's irrelevant. They're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
They all answer to corporate interests. What the United States system wants to do, because they see their own people as just another population to divide and distract. They know you're going to pick one side or the other. They have to pretend that there are some differences. And all they care about is you pick one side or the other, because if you pick one side or the other, you'll be holding at least half of the agenda up. Maybe not the other. You might oppose it, but not too much to impede it. You're going to at least support and hold up part of the agenda. So you have people on the left who are very but it's changing. I've seen a lot of lefties really getting bent out of shape over China as well. I mean, lefties. We could argue about the terms and everything. I think people know what I mean by that. In the American way of using the word. They are fully invested in this Ukraine thing. Republicans, you can see a lot of them are extremely anti-China, and so you could use both one party when you want to push the Russia and Ukraine issue, and you go to the other party to push the China issue, the China and Taiwan issue. The Taiwan's part of China, but that's the way they present it. So you'll get sucked into one side or the other, and you'll be holding up at least one part of the agenda. But as you can see from one administration to the next, the example of Iran and the nuclear deal started under Obama, knowing full well before it was even signed that they were going to backtrack on it deliberately, accuse Iran baselessly of violating it, and use it way down the road in the future as a pretext to pile on more sanctions and even engage in aggression against Iran. That went from Obama to Trump to Biden. Each administration played their role. Didn't matter, Republican, Democrat, didn't matter. And that is exactly what's going to happen. I mean, in many ways, that is exactly how we got to this situation in Ukraine. This didn't start under Obama or Trump or Biden. All three administrations have played their role. I mean, this goes all the way back to the Cold War, but also right after the Cold War. We remember different circles in the West promising they won't expand NATO eastward, and then they did. We remember Bush Jr. Withdrawing from arms agreements with Russia. He did that. Trump did that. Obama did that. They all did it because the people writing the policy wanted this done, and they did it. Didn't matter who was in the White House. Doesn't matter who is in Congress. When it needs to be done, it gets done. And then they have the spin doctors come in and try to explain it to these people who are invested in these empty ideologies that they think they believe in and that they think matter.
I feel Bush Jr. probably caused the biggest amount of damage to the US administration, but obviously he went into Iraq. But there's other things that's not really reported much on the media. He was the main reason why Russia went into Georgia, if you remember. You know, it's some of the things that he said basically pushed Russia into Georgia, and he was pushing for Georgia to join NATO and all sorts of what's happening behind the scenes. But also, Bush Jr. also destroyed the relationship between United States and North Korea at the time. You know, things were escalating very fast with North Korea because of George Bush Jr. And I think the situation we have today with North Korea having nuclear weapons was basically because of Mr. George Bush Jr.'s actions. And back then they didn't have nuclear weapons, but basically the United States decided to place sanctions on North Korea, decided not to talk to North Korea, not to engage with them, and look where they are now. And many other things that happened throughout the world when Mr. Bush Jr. was there. Obviously Afghanistan as well, but he seems to have caused the biggest amount of damage to the US empire when he was there.
Yeah, it seems like that. And it did definitely happen during the Bush administration. But I think that was just a coincidence because it was at that juncture in time that the United States realized that, hey, the window of opportunity is going to close a lot faster than we thought it was. And we need to accelerate this. So what can we do? You know, a global war on terror gives us access to the whole planet. We can create almost any pretext to get into a country, at least covertly, with our special forces and move things around the way we need to create this system that we want and to prevent certain players from rising up on the game board. And so that's what they did. So it was a huge time of transformation. It just so happened that Bush Jr. we've all heard the guy talk. The guy he was obviously not making any of these decisions himself. He had people around him doing it. And ironically, and not surprisingly, these are the same people who are involved to this day in the administration or in these think tanks whether they're in office or they're in the think tanks, they are still pushing the agenda forward. It's continuity of agenda, and it's because we have a circle of special interests, corporations, and financial institutions. They're the ones driving all of this. They don't get elected. They're always, in office.
Exactly. I'm going to kind of talk about the final thing we were going to discuss was basically about this chip war that's happening between United States and China. And Bush recently announced that he was going to stop all chip sales to loads of Chinese tech companies. He announced bills that if you are U.S. citizens working for a Chinese firm, you need to leave that firm and come back to the US, or you could lose your citizenship. There's loads of kind of things he's doing. But when it comes to China, I read a paper coming out of the West saying, why isn't China retaliating to all of these chip sanctions that China's getting? Because China seems to retaliate every time US seems to do anything with Taiwan. Where, for example, Pelosi going into Taiwan, they retaliated. When the Europeans decided to do something really stupid and sanction some Chinese diplomats, China did the same thing. But US seems to be placing sanction after sanction after sanctions on these chip sanctions on China, and China seems to be doing much about it. Is it because I mean, what I think is basically they did the same thing with the space station, for example, and the weapons as well, because at the time,
Exactly. I know where you're going with this, but
yeah.
no, go ahead, continue.
So what I feel is what I feel they're doing, they're secretly, thinking, what, you place these sanctions on us. What we're going to do is build up our own space station. We're going to build up our own, weapons infrastructure and weapon systems. And when we are at a stage when we are better than you, that's when you will come to us, and that's when we can say, what, screw you. This is what this is what what's happening with the space station. The Chinese are now way ahead of NASA when it comes to space. NASA, people don't think people believe that NASA's is great in space, but NASA has been losing its budget. Throughout the years, NASA has been losing more and more of its budget for space, and which means NASA is very limited to what it can do. And obviously now you have the rise of SpaceX and private companies. But most of that money is going into the military-industrial complex instead. But now you have China, and now they got a space station up there. They got plans to go into the moon and build a base in the moon with the Russians. They're way ahead of schedule when it comes to space. They're way ahead of schedule when it comes to the weapons. They have got their own aircraft carriers, their 5th-generation fighter jets, hypersonic missiles, and all of this stuff. And I think United States wanted to use the Chinese space station for some of their experiments, and China said no. And one of the things that has happened is, from all these sanctions wars, is Russia is leaving the International Space Station, and that is a huge problem, because Russia was the country which was keeping the International Space Station in orbit, because what they have, they keep in orbit, and without them, it's going to be very hard to keep the International Space Station in orbit, and that could, eventually they're saying that they may have to discontinue the International Space Station, and that would leave only Chinese space station, up in space, which would be a huge blow to the West and NASA. But going back to the chip war thing, do you think that China is secretly developing their own chip architecture secretly? Not secretly, but they are pushing the whole country towards this, and obviously they have a very good motivation, and they're basically saying, United States is against us. They're trying to stop our development. So let's everyone kind of focus on building this chip semiconductor architecture by ourselves. We don't need the West. And when we do build it, the West will come to us asking for chips, because when China build it, obviously it's going to be much cheaper. and it's going to take out a lot of business from Western companies, semiconductor companies, AMD, Nvidia, TSMC. Already their shares have gone down in half. So is there something you think China is using as a motivation tool to kind of get to that stage? That's why they are not retaliating, because they don't want to make the matter worse. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. That is exactly what they're doing. I was just looking before we started. I was looking at a Voice of America article titled "China Trying to Fight Back U.S. Ban on Its Chip Industry." And that's exactly what they're doing. It says China is spending 143 billion to combat U.S. moves to cut off its supply of semiconductor technology, and what it's doing is pouring all of that money into research and development domestically. And that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to build, first, they're going to build comparable chips to what is available in the West. And then they're going to build chips that are better than anything in the West. And you just said it, these Western chip makers were looking at what the US government was doing. They said, but we have a market share in China. Now you've just closed us off from it. And that all of that money, I mean, we are the best in the world right now because we make all of that money and then we put a percentage of that into research and development, which allows us to stay on top. Now we cannot do that. How are we going to do that? So again, it was just like the example of Boeing and Airbus. They're shooting themselves in the foot by doing this because they simply cannot accept that they are not going to be number one anymore. It makes no sense that they're number one. They've got a smaller country in terms of population, in terms of industry, in terms of everything that actually matters. They are smaller. They should have a lower rank in terms of power and influence. It only makes sense. It's only fair. And what China and Russia and many others are trying to do is build a balance of power across the world. They're not trying to consolidate power. We talked about this, you and I, AJ, when we were talking about the Chinese military and the technology that they're developing. It is not configured to project power globally. It's configured to protect China. So the West is hurting themselves. They could have kept, of course, China's eventually going to catch up. But until then, all of these Western chip manufacturers would have been making huge profits. Even after China caught up, these companies were still going to have niche markets where they could make money. Now they can't make any money in China. And now China's going to surpass them anyway. It's interesting you bring up the space industry. China actually launches a huge number of rockets every year. Very close to the same number as the US, sometimes more, sometimes a little less. And the only reason why the US is able to compete is because of SpaceX. If SpaceX never came along, and people might not realize this, but the US aerospace monopoly conglomeration, they actually tried to get rid of SpaceX early on. They did not want SpaceX getting involved in government contracts, and SpaceX had a fight to get that. The only reason why the US is even close to competing with China right now is because of SpaceX. These other corporations, Boeing, Lockheed, they have something called the United Launch Alliance. They are so backwards, so far behind, so over budget. Nothing they say they're going to make ever comes even close to on schedule, under budget, or on budget. And only until SpaceX came along where they, a fire was lit underneath them to kind of motivate them to actually give taxpayers some sort of value for their money. So this is a reoccurring theme in America, and it's not something that can be solved anytime soon. The circles of interest right now have to collapse and be displaced by something that makes much more sense, and something, a group of people and interests, circle of interests, that can accept America as part of a multipolar world rather than irrationally trying to impose itself on the rest of humanity, which cannot happen, will not happen.
I don't think SpaceX is going to last, Brian, because I think we're coming at a point where Elon Musk is losing a lot of money. He's lost around 200 billion of its own wealth. Tesla's not doing well. His share price has gone down by half. Twitter's not doing very well. So he's going to be looking to cut back on things, and SpaceX is not a company that makes profit, because the way SpaceX is funded is through mainly his own money. And he sent an email out to SpaceX employees last year, 2021, end of 2021. And he said everyone needs to work hard or work uh, overtime, because SpaceX, if they don't, then the SpaceX is going to go bankrupt. And it's been a whole year. And 2022, if you look at how many launches SpaceX done, it's not many compared to 2020, 2021. Their launches have been going down, down, and down, and down. He said he was going to go to Mars by 2025. He's only got 2 years left. And he was talking about sending a colony to Mars and things like that. I think he's not even talking about that anymore. I think his dream for space is over, and I think SpaceX is slowly going to die down over this year and next year. I just don't think Elon has it in him to juggle all of these balls. And now that he's bought Twitter, all of his time is going to be spent on Twitter, trying to build that company up. And I just don't think. I think SpaceX is gonna disappear. I mean, what's your thoughts, Brian?
Well, I don't know. I really haven't had time. I had been following the progress of SpaceX for many years. The last year or two, not really. He's always going to be in a precarious situation, because if he tries to actually progress, the state of technology and the human race, he will always be confined by a system. The United States is essentially a system that it is a monopoly. It does not want change. It wants to maintain things the way they are, because that is the easiest. It's the easiest to maximize profits. So when he came along, this is exactly why they didn't want SpaceX getting involved. They were developing a rocket that could be reused over and over again, and it would save huge amounts of money and would drop the cost for launches. When you drop the cost for launches, that takes away the profit margins that these other corporations were making. The United Launch Alliance. How are they going to justify telling the government, well, you still need to pay us like 3 times more to launch the same thing into space? So this is why they wanted to get rid of him. They still want to get rid of him as long as he's doing this. You see him do things that kind of go along. He was using SpaceX to aid literal Nazis in Ukraine. And if he didn't, they would have went after him. If he does it, he's paying into it. He's helping perpetuate a system that is eventually going to create conditions where he cannot exist. Think about it this way. He's helping Nazis in Ukraine. He's helping this proxy war against Russia. What do you think the U.S. government and the establishment around the government is going to ask him to do when it comes time to do all of these things to China? He has a factory in China. They're going to tell him, close your factory and get out of China. That's what they're going to tell him. And his whole business there in China will disappear. And they're not going to care about, what he does afterwards. And you see the U.S. wrecking the entirety of the European continent. They don't care about one guy's electric car company. I can tell you that. So someone like Elon Musk, he's super smart. There's no denying that. He's made a lot of achievements. He's a leader. He's not sitting there designing everything himself. He's got talented people around him. They're creating these things. But at the end of the day, he's not looking at this realistically and in a sense of self-preservation against the very real dangers that surround him. I would not want to have a company like his in the United States. I would want it to be somewhere else.
Yeah, the Chinese are not very fond of Elon Musk themselves. There's loads of stories about one of his satellites nearly, basically nearly crashing into the Chinese space station. They also banned Tesla cars from Chinese government institutions. And so no Tesla cars is allowed to drive near government locations because they don't trust Tesla, basically. And they also said that they've seen what Elon Musk has done with Ukraine when it comes to SpaceX. So when there is ever a conflict in the Taiwanese Strait, you can guarantee that SpaceX would be involved in some way or rather, giving satellites signals to Taiwan. So China is very aware of this, and
he's kind of in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation now. I personally, I would want to set my company up somewhere else, outside of that type of environment, where I would be able to pursue the things that I want to without this. You're always, if you have a big company that does something like launch stuff into space, the government's always going to want to be involved. The military is always going to want to be involved. So which country do you do that in? Do you do it in a country where the military invades other countries and kills 1 million people based on a deliberate lie? Do you want to be connected with that? These are questions you have to truly ask yourself. You cannot pretend that doesn't exist and just go on doing what you want to do. SpaceX is launching satellites for the U.S. military. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I think anyone who tries to do something in this world, do something positive and for humanity, you're always going to face resistance. You're always going to be surrounded by greedy people who try to exploit you, and by doing so, they will inhibit your ability to make the advances that you want. This comment that you've got on the screen, it was absolutely disgusting what they did to someone curing cancer. I just did a video about gene therapy, and I showed a TED Talk from 2012 where this guy was explaining how gene therapy, you give this to somebody one time, and you never have to give it to them again because you've altered the cells in their body, and now their body can correct whatever the problem is permanently. So how can you make money off of that? So he said, forget about the cost of making it because it's really cheap to make it. What is the value of saving your kid? This is what he was saying to an audience in public on a stage. He's dangling life over the head of a dying kid and saying, no. I know it's cheap. Forget about that. What is it actually worth to save your kid? If you had to go to get regular treatments, you spend $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, and your kid would still die. I can save your kid. What's that worth to you? That's what he's saying on stage in public. These are the kind of people that exist all around the world, but specifically in the West, this is a real thing where this type of behavior is admired. And how do you succeed and contribute to society in an environment like this? I don't know how to do it without compromising yourself. That's why I don't live in the West.
Yeah.
to be honest with you.
I watched the whole speech, and I think there was one part where he said that if you're not earning $4,000 a month, then that's embarrassing. Then you are, so you're saying some ridiculous stuff basically, and people are clapping and cheering, and I'm thinking, oh God, but yeah, it's absolutely crazy. So I was going to talk about Chinese EV cars. Somebody mentioned that BYD is half the price of Tesla. Well, you can see Tesla shares have gone down more than half, and this year it looks like it's going to be the rise of the Chinese EV cars. Chinese EV cars have made a huge stride. It's not just BYD, but there's other companies like XPeng, NIO, and they're starting to deliver in different parts of the world, and they're going to be expanding. And they have got huge factories in China manufacturing things very quickly, very cheap. And I think Tesla's in some serious trouble, and this is one of the reasons why their share prices have gone down. And instead of focusing on Tesla, Elon Musk goes and buys Twitter. And you're 100% right. First of all, when he started SpaceX, it was all about helping humanity, going to Mars. He had lots of great plans for SpaceX.
Same with Tesla, also.
Yeah. And now SpaceX has now turned into a military thing. With satellites and sending signals to Ukraine, and he's not even talking about Mars anymore. And now with Tesla cars and people are saying that Tesla cars have got lots of secret stuff that you don't know about, like the remote sensoring and remote cameras and lots of things as well. So you got to be really, really careful when you're buying Tesla products. But yeah, I think Elon Musk has done an own goal by buying Twitter, especially during this market, and he's lost 200 billion, and I think that's got to hurt. And he's got to be thinking in the back of his mind, the way, is this really what he really wanted? Because all of these, serving the neocon, serving the government, is not really making him richer. He's actually making him poorer. So he's got to be,
Yeah. In his defense, he has said, with Tesla, he says, the whole point of this whole reason he started it was because nobody was working on electric cars. Now everyone is working on electric cars. And I think a lot of the work that he had been doing, I don't know if it's still the case, but he said a lot of it, the patents are open. Anyone can use them. There's no, there's no restrictions. I remember him talking to an Air Force general, and he was actually saying many very positive and I would say enlightened things about China, working in China, and the reality of China surpassing the West. And you could see the Air Force general is like just going in one ear, out the other. He completely did not understand what he was saying. But he was saying, you make this open source, and the way you keep ahead is not by closing knowledge, it's by keeping ahead in terms of innovation. And I think I have heard him say that if someone comes along and they can make more electric cars cheaper, and Tesla is gone, then that's the whole point, was to get people making electric cars. Maybe he's changed his mind since then. I don't know, but I seem to remember something like that. Maybe he thought, and this speculation on my part, he thought he can see the corner he's painting himself into, and he thought getting Twitter, getting this public town square, and cleaning it out. He's doing the Twitter files. We can't deny that the Twitter files is not helping. We all knew this. People like you and I knew that. People in your audience knew this, but a lot of ordinary people had no idea this was going on. Now they do. I think that is a great service, the Twitter files.
Yeah.
So he's not an entirely good person. He's not entirely evil. He does some good things. He does some bad things. I'm not going to not criticize him for sending Skylink to Ukraine and Nazis using it to kill people. That is bad. You have to say that is bad. But the Twitter files, that is a good thing. So anyway, I don't know. Maybe he's trying to think of a way out of this. I don't know. I don't know if it'll work. I'm not a billionaire. I don't have all the answers. I can't fix all of these things myself either. It's not easy. So, I see someone, Jenny Lynn, talk about we'll coup who we want. Now, I've actually looked into that claim. That was about Bolivia and the lithium. And I looked into that. Tesla does not get any lithium from Bolivia. They have no interest in getting lithium from Bolivia. What that was Elon Musk being extremely inappropriate, not thinking before he talks. And again, he should be criticized for saying things like that. These coups might seem funny to someone sitting in the United States. If you're in a country that's being destabilized by the U.S., it's not funny. It's your friends and family, their lives at risk. Places that you walk by on a daily basis getting burned to the ground. I've lived it here in Thailand. It's not funny, so it's a bad joke, very bad joke. He should be condemned for it. But I don't think that he was involved in a coup in Bolivia, because they were not getting lithium from Bolivia. They have absolutely no plans to get lithium from Bolivia. And also the U.S. has been trying to overthrow the Bolivian government since before lithium was even a thing people were interested in. So, I mean, it's a combination of, we have to look into all of these things. We got to follow the truth wherever it takes us, even if it's a place that brings us somewhere that's a little uncomfortable or doesn't necessarily buttress the concept we had in our mind originally.
Yeah, I wanted to also kind of bring up this point that John, the accountant, has brought up, saying EV will not succeed in the longer term. Toyota CEO announced Toyota will not be building EVs. First of all, I think Toyota is making a big mistake. I think most of Japan and Japanese cars are not really pushing forward for this EV, but that's because they're used to making cars with the petrol and diesel engines, so they're going to have to change the whole infrastructure. It's not easy, and this is why Toyota's not really going into EV. And I think it's a big mistake, because in the short term, at least for another 10 years or maybe 20 years, EVs are going to be big. Hydrogen is an issue, because to make hydrogen you need energy, and right now the world is making hydrogen using fossil fuels, and this is what you call gray hydrogen, I believe. The real renewable way to make hydrogen is using green hydrogen, which means you use renewable energy to build hydrogen. And I think right now China has got the biggest amount of green hydrogen production factories in the world by a considerable margin, and I'm talking about a huge margin. They have got massive kind of solar and wind generators in the desert, and they are kind of building all of these green hydrogen plants. Europe cannot build green hydrogen plants because they haven't got any solar or wind they can use to build these green hydrogen. So unless the world goes completely renewables in the next 10, 20 years, I don't think hydrogen will be big, but it will be big in China though, because they are building the infrastructure for it, and they have the infrastructure for it as well, and not many
I,
countries do.
I
Sorry, go on.
I think, I mean, I think it's a good topic to talk about. There's
Mm,
what with technology though. What I warn people against is making predictions about the future. We can all go to like the funniest predictions ever made, where you got some guy talking about how humans will never fly or something, and then that guy
yeah,
might have thought he was a smarty pants back then, but now people are laughing at him indefinitely into the future. So we have to be careful about that. Electric vehicles right now, I mean, there's companies that make money making them, so it's a viable product. I don't know how viable it will be into the future. Maybe something will come along and displace it. You have to remember that battery technology is constantly improving and changing. And then we have alternatives. We have things like hydrogen. Maybe the barriers to hydrogen now will be lowered in the future. We don't know. We have to follow all of these things very closely to understand how it might change in the near future. And then in the distant future, there's no way to tell, because there's a lot of things that, just think about it. When you were using a typewriter, could you imagine using computers the way that we use them now? I know I couldn't have. So
that's right.
technology is a tricky thing.
Yeah, I think the world is waiting for fusion energy to come into place, because with fusion energy, you've got an unlimited supply of energy. And with that, you can do whatever the hell you want. You can make hydrogen plants and, without using fossil fuels and things like that. But fusion energy is always 20 years away. Every time I listen to articles on,
It's been 20 years
yeah, I mean,
since like 80 years ago.
yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I was reading new about fusion power, and they've made a breakthrough here, they made a breakthrough there, and it's been almost like 30, 40 years now, and still the same. I still hear the same things. We're still 20 years away. We made a breakthrough here, we made a breakthrough there. It's not going to be easy, and I hope that they can somehow do the fusion energy before we destroy the Earth. With all of these with fossil fuels. But,
Chris Cox talks about the geological capacity to produce hydrogen. I don't know about Norway, but I know Iceland has geothermal power, tremendous amount. And I do believe they have basically like a hydrogen economy there, or the beginnings of one. And so that is actually an example of what you're talking about, AJ, where you have an ability to create it without using fossil fuels or whatever, and you're using a renewable source or a constant source that's already there. You just have to tap it. So that is an example of where it's appropriate, and maybe different types of technology aren't going to be appropriate everywhere. I know here in Thailand, a lot of people buy solar. The government's not subsidizing it or anything. It's just because it's always hot and sunny here. It makes sense. But if you try to do the same thing further north, it might not pay off. It might not be practical. So there's that also. We could probably have a whole episode about technology. Technology is something that I'm actually very interested in. I'm an industrial designer by trade.
oh, cool.
And I use a lot of technology, 3D design, 3D printing, electronic prototyping. So, I've been following all of this for a very long time. And I think that it's actually key to geopolitics and multipolarism.
Yeah.
Because what is multipolarism? It's all of these. It's not China and Russia protesting at the UN. Oh, we want a multipolar world. We don't want the US to be in charge of everything. They're creating alternatives that the rest of the world can pay into, and they're redistributing the balance of power by creating alternatives to these corporates and financial monopolies the West has clung on to for so long and benefited from for so long. And how are they doing that? They're doing it through technology, by creating factories that make things, by investing in research and development, by taking away all of this power and money and technology that's been concentrated into the hands of the West. They are redistributing it by investing in it and by doing business and trade.
And with that point, I wanted to kind of put a close to it. Thanks for joining us again, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Do you wanted to have any last words before we go? And we have over 1,000, I think 1,200 viewers, which is a really really good number. So thanks for all of you guys who have joined in and taken the time to listen to us. We'll do it again soon. Thanks to all the moderators as well. And so I'll leave the final words to Brian if you've got anything to say.
Well, thanks again, AJ, for having me on. I'm always happy to join you and your audience. I think it's easy to get laser focused on just like one geopolitical thing. Like the conflict in Ukraine. Almost every video I've done over the last year has been about that. I'm trying to branch into other things that I think are extremely important, things that I have been covering for years that I'm not giving enough attention to. So I just want to say thank you for all of the support everyone has given me over the last year. This year, I'm going to continue following the conflict in Ukraine. It is pivotal. It is the pivotal conflict right now. But I also want to start talking about these other aspects of multipolarism. And I want to get more into the things we can do as individuals to invest in multipolarism. It's not just something, the foreign minister of Russia can do. It's something we can all get involved in and help pay into. So thanks again, AJ, for having me, and just wishing everyone well into 2023.
Yeah, thanks for Brian. Oh, I just noticed one last thing in my notes we didn't discuss, and that's Qatar. And I just wanted to have your thoughts about this because Qatar has been a very friendly country to the West over the years, and it's got obviously military bases, and it's been helping the US launch attacks into Afghanistan, Iraq, and also escape from Afghanistan as well. And it's been a launch pad for the Middle East. And I thought it was a very friendly country to the West. And when the World Cup started in Qatar, you see all of these ridiculous stories about human rights and stuff like that. And Qataris were absolutely incensed by this media coverage of absolutely demonizing them. Because the same people who've been demonizing Qatar are seen in Dubai holidaying. These millionaires and billionaires are in Dubai holidaying. And you can see, like, for example, Gary Lineker was one of the hosts for the World Cup. And he was very instrumental in his condemnation of Qatar. But if you Google Gary Lineker in Dubai, you will see him holidaying in Dubai, enjoying himself. How does he think the infrastructure in Dubai was built? I mean, it's almost like double standards. And the Qataris were so incensed by the West's treatment of Qatar that they signed a deal with China one day after the World Cup opened, because they obviously they've seen all the articles, and they said, you know what, we're just going to sign this gas deal with China. And
Well, AJ,
yeah,
maybe Qatar was getting all this flack specifically because they've already planned to do it. Because we have to remember that the U.S. has no friends. Everyone is a means to their end, and a disposable means at that. So am I back? AJ, are you there? Hello?
Can you
Hello?
hear me? Hi.
Yeah, but something wrong with my internet connection.
Oh,
So,
okay,
so,
good.
so what I was saying, I hope I wasn't like frozen in too embarrassing of a pose.
No.
Yeah, so Qatar and many other countries that are perceived as being U.S. allies, we're going to see this. We're going to see them looking out for their own best interests. We're going to see the U.S. put pressure on them, and that pressure is going to build until eventually we see what we saw during the World Cup, where they're just completely smearing Qatar, and the pressure will just build from there. Next, you'll see a color revolution. Saudi Arabia better be looking out. And I know this seems hard to believe for a lot of people out there, but even Israel right now has a regime in power that is entirely obedient to the U.S., but things will change regionally and globally where that regime is not going to be able to survive. And people more interested in the self-preservation and progress of the actual people living there, Israeli and Palestinian, eventually will work their way in. We could already see how foreign policy in Israel is kind of reacting in unpredictable ways to what's going on in Ukraine, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. So nothing is a sure thing. There's transformation happening, and all of the we have to keep an open mind, and we have to look very objectively at what's going on inside these countries to understand what's really going on. The concept of, well, they're friends, so I don't know, that can't be. No, they're not friends. Follow the money, follow the associations, and that is how you're going to sort everything out. I saw Danny Haifang in the chat. I actually will be on his show next. Right now it's almost 9 p.m. here. I will be on his show at 11 p.m. Bangkok.
Oh, okay. Yeah, looking forward to it. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, I live in UK, and one of the most ridiculous articles I've seen about Qatar is about a man who walked 7 hours to find the nearest place to get alcohol. And I'm thinking, hang on a second, that story can't be true, because imagine walking in the desert for 7 hours, because Qatar is a desert country, right? Imagine walking in the sun in the heat for 7 hours. You would die. I mean, I went to I go to the Middle East regularly, and I can't survive 5 minutes in the heat because it's so hot. And it doesn't matter what time of year you go, because even in the winter it gets hot. And so this guy apparently walked 7 miles to get alcohol. Obviously, these.
Where did he find it? Where did he find alcohol? I mean, did
No
he
idea.
keep walking until he reached France,
exactly.
or what happened?
Exactly. I mean, it just seems like absolutely ludicrous. It seems like maybe he walked all the way to Dubai by the sounds of it. But stories like that coming out in the Western papers, you just got to laugh. And one of the stories that came out of the West is saying that Qatar had X number of migrant workers dying over the last 5 years. But hello, what happened during the last 5 years? You had COVID, right? And most of these deaths were COVID related. So the media likes to twist all of these stories and words. And the Qataris are absolutely incensed. I mean, I know a Qatari personally. He's a very good friend of mine. And he tells me, everyone in Qatar has had enough of the West. They've had enough of bending over backwards, trying to please the West. Since this World Cup, they've realized who their real friends are, and it's not the West. And you can see a lot of changing policies, not just coming from Qatar, but also from Saudi Arabia, Dubai, and the rest of Middle East.
Absolutely.
Anyway, thanks, Brian. Thanks for coming in and joining. And thanks, everyone. And really appreciate everyone coming on, and looking forward to the show with Danny and Brian. So I'll definitely tune in. Make sure you guys tune into that. And we'll see you shortly, and hopefully soon. Take care, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.